He recently received a PhD honoris causa at the University of Montpellier and was the recipient of the prestigious honorary fellow title at the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation in 2022. His research is centered in understanding the evolution of tropical communities using the fossil record of the past 120 million years. He's also an amazing human being who has been committed in not only training, but also highlighting and fostering the next generation of tropical paleobotanists and paleobiologists from Latin America. So without further ado, Carlos Jaramillo.
Thank you, Monica. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I will go mad if the wonders do not cease. Those were the words that Alexander von Humboldt wrote in his first letter back home when he went for the first time to the tropics in South America. Because he will go to one place and will find some plants and animals, then move 20 kilometers away and we'll find another set of plants and animals that were different from the first one. So after a few weeks, he was going mad because the diversity was very high. And if you want to study the tropics, you have to be a little bit mad because this diversity is a bless, but it's also a curse because every group you work with has hundreds of species. And I and our colleagues at the Smithsonian in Panama, we have been studying the tropical ecosystem for a long time because it's a complex system, and to be able to understand it properly, you need to see the system from many different points of view. And one of them is through its geological history. And that's what I'm going to tell you a little bit about. Now, when you think about the tropics, the neotropics, the first things that come to your mind, especially to the general audiences, is the tropical rainforest. But in fact, when you go to the neotropics, you realize that there is not only tropical rainforest, but many different biomes within the tropical latitudes, including, and you see them here in the graphic. All the different colors represent the major biomes we have today, from a tropical rainforest, tropical dry forest, savannas, the montane forest, the Páramo and Puna, the Yunga, the Mata Atlántica, and the Central American montane forest. Now, one critical element to understand why these biomes exist and how they originate is understanding the climate, especially CO2. And probably you have, if you are a scientist, probably you have written a grant in the last 3 or 4 years where always you have to add at the end climate change. And if you are a geologist, well, climate change is something that you learn the first day of school because the climate of the planet has always been changed. And we know about the relationship between CO2 and temperature for a long time. So in 1861, this Irish scientist, J. Tyndall, put together this machine because he wanted to measure what the effect that the gases had on the temperature of the planet. And he realized that using this machine that you see here, that when you have CO2, you increase the CO2, the temperature of the atmosphere will increase. So we have known that for a long time, more than 170 years, that every time CO2 goes up, the planet warms, and every time the CO2 goes down, the planet cools down. Now something, right now, so the last week, we reached 426 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Before the Industrial Revolution, we were in 280. So we have increased in 146 parts in less than 200 years. But those numbers per se probably don't tell you too much. So what I'm going to show you is how this number fare in terms of the magnitude and the rate. But comparing those numbers with the geological past. Now in this graphic, you will see geological time here, going from today to the last 800,000 years. And so people have been drilling ice in Antarctica, and we are able to measure the CO2 direct in the bubbles that were trapped in the ice cores. So this is a direct measurement of the value of CO2 concentration over the last 800,000 years. And you will see here, as you see in the graphic, that the value of CO2 has changed between 280 and 180 during the glaciation interglaciation that had been driven by Milankovitch cyclicity. So the magnitude of change here is 100 parts per million. Now, if you take a deeper view in time, so the CO2 levels of the last 120 million years, you will realize that having low CO2, this 100 to 180 to 280 values, has been an oddity rather than a constant value for most of the recent geological time. So, in fact, probably most of the genera that we have today worldwide originate when the CO2 levels were higher than we have today. If you will have to go back right now about 4.5 million years to breathe the same CO2 that we are breathing right now. So we are already past the last 2.6 million years in CO2 values. What about the rate? So we already know that the magnitude, having high levels of CO2, has been a constant rather than an oddity. What about the change, how fast this change has happened? Well, here I went back to the same ice core that I showed you before, and I calculate how much CO2 has increased or decreased in a 200-year time interval for the past 800,000 years. And this is the number, 0.6 parts per million every 200 years. Then I did the same analysis for the fastest warming that has ever happened in the last 400 years, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. This is a unique event that happened about 56 million years ago, where the temperature of the planet increased by 5 to 7 Celsius worldwide, and it lasted only 200,000 years. And this is the fastest warming we know before our modern warming. And in a 200-year interval, the increase was 5.2 parts per million. Now, when you put these two values in context to what has happening today, you realize how staggering fast the CO2 increase has happened. So you see here 0.6 in the last 800,000 years, 5.2 in the fastest warming ever, and we have increased 146 parts per million in 200 years. So it's about 240 times faster than has ever happened in geological history. Now I thought, well, what else could be on a similar magnitude? Well, and is human population. Here in the graphic you see in the y-axis the geological time from the point of the origin of our species around 220,000 years ago. And as you go up in the graphic, you will see the increasing human population. And you will see that the staggering increase in human population at the end of the graphic correlates with the staggering increase in CO2 that we have experienced in the last 200 years. I did the same analysis with the CO2, but with human population. And as you see here, if you calculate how much the population had increased in a 200-year interval between our point of origin and the year 0, would be about 42 million every 200 years. Between the year 0 and the year 1823, we have increased about 800 million every 200 years. And in the last 200 years, we have increased 6,900 million people. So it's about 160 times faster than any time in the history of our own species. And you can see this staggering increase at any local level. So this is, for instance, Panama City. Today has 2 million people, but in 1851, and that's where I live, in 1851, we were only 5,000 people. And this yellow dot here was the size of Panama City 200 years ago. Now, something else that I hope you keep in mind is that, so we have had all this CO2 in the last 200 years. And we have been doing that by burning rock that contain carbon. Now, the opposite process, taking the CO2 that we put in the atmosphere, that is already in the atmosphere, in the water, back in the rock where it came from, can only happen through a geological process that is called weathering. And weathering operates at geological time scale. So it means that even if we stop adding CO2 today, it will take about 5,000 years to go back to the CO2 we had 200 years ago. 5,000 years. Because we don't know any other process that can sequester this carbon in the atmosphere and put it back in the rock. So regardless of we want it or not, the climate already changed for a long, long time. And probably, I don't know if you are aware of this, but last week, our planet, consumed 96 million barrels of oil per day. And this is the highest consumption per day in human history. And even though we have been talking about climate change for the last 20 years, in the last 5 years, there are all kinds of conventions, agreements, and the reality is how much CO2, how much petroleum we are using. And once again, last week, we used the maximum of amount of petroleum per day that has ever happened in human history. Now, something that also I hope you take away from this lecture is that there is an immediate response between CO2 and the temperature of the atmosphere. And that's, we see that in the record. So we add all this extra CO2, and the expectation is the temperature of the atmosphere will go up, and in fact has increased by about 1.5 degrees Celsius in the last 200 years. So the response to the atmosphere, of the temperature of the atmosphere to the increase of CO2 is almost instantaneous. But that's not the whole story. First, the records that you hear in the news that the temperature had increased by 1.5 degrees, well, that's a global average. And we know from the geological record and from what is happening today that there is a temperature polar amplification. So it means that if you hear 1.5 degrees on average, it means that the pole is going to be warmer than that, and the tropics are going to be lower than that. And in fact, if you go to Barro Colorado Island, that we have one of the longest records of temperature anywhere in the tropics, the temperature has not increased too much. It's a very tiny amount compared to what has increased in the pole. So there is always a polar temperature amplification. And second, that there are three elements in the climate that operates at a longer time scale. So the first one is the ocean. There is a huge amount of water that stores heat, and that heat is released back to the atmosphere, but doesn't happen right away. It takes hundreds of years for that to happen. The second is the vegetation. Imagine the Amazonian rainforest. Well, it takes a tree last 150 to 200 years, so we need at least 500 years to see an impact of the vegetation back on climate until the trees are able to grow and die, and there is a new tree growing. And the last one is the ice that we have in the Arctic and the Antarctic, because the ice melts. But it melts much slower than the temperature in the atmosphere. So these three elements will have a feedback on the climate. So it means that right now the climate that we have today and we had since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution is out of balance. So if you do a global circulation model, and what the scientists do with these big supercomputers, in the model, you set a boundary condition, let's say CO2 at 400 parts per million, and then you have to wait about 1,000 years in computer times until all the elements in the climate are on balance. And that's when you really know what is the climate you are going to have at that particular CO2 level. But if you think about, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we are setting a new experiment every year, because every year we add the CO2, add a little bit more of CO2. So every year the climate is starting from scratch, the whole experiment again. And if you go back to 4.5 million years when we didn't have, we had the same levels of CO2 we have today, you wouldn't have ice in the Arctic. So, and that's the reason that when you want to predict the climate of the future, you come to a major problem. So right now we have about 6 major global circulation models. So every 2 or 3 years, the United Nations release the predictions for the climate of the future, and the models agree in many things, but they disagree the most in what is going to happen to precipitation in the interior of the continents, especially in the tropics. So for instance, this is a simulation, and so how can you tell if the models, because all of the models are built with the same data today, but they produce different predictions in the future, how can you tell which model is correct or closer to the truth? Well, one way would be just waiting 100 years to see who was right, but probably that's not a very smart idea. The other is you apply that to the past, to times where you have similar conditions, and compare the outcomes of the model to what you see in the empirical data of the fossil, of the geological record. For instance, this is a modeling, the best modeling we have for this Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the fastest warming I showed you before. And the prediction is that once you do that, Amazonia should be a desert, or it should be covered with grasses, because it would be so hot that plants could not live. But as I will show you, the fossil record doesn't show that. So there is something fundamental missing in the global climate models today, and probably they are related to vegetation and how the vegetation had a feedback on the climate. If you are working in the tropics, even though the climate doesn't change too much throughout the year, the history of the tropics itself is the history of a total transformation of an ecosystem. So if you went back to the tropics 140 million years ago, you would not find a single flowering plant. And you go today to any place in the tropics, and you will find that most of the biomass is dominated by flowering plants. So the history of the tropics is the history of full transformation of an ecosystem. And I have divided this in 2 chapters. The first one is the Cretaceous, because it's a world that is quite different from what we have today, or we have in the Cenozoic, the last 66 million years. And it's a world that is not dominated by angiosperm. So we have this flora from central Colombia, 136 million years. We haven't found the first angiosperm. This couple of photos of one of the oldest angiosperms ever found from the beginning of the Cretaceous. Keep in mind that the Cretaceous is a very interesting time because it's really warm, about 7 Celsius in the tropic, warmer than today. And this is how the world looked like 120 million years ago. So Australia and Africa and South America will be connected. And probably in the tropics, we have a vegetation belt in the interior of the continent dominated by dry biomes, and the opposite ends dominated by wet biomes. But within a framework of 7 Celsius warmer than today, and about 1,000 ppm of CO2. There are, for instance, this group of plants called the Nitales. The pollen grains from the Nitales are very diverse in the tropical latitudes, and very strange pollen grains. We don't have anything similar nowadays. And Monica Carvalho and Fabiani Herrera from the Field Museum, and Monica Carvalho from the University of Michigan, and we have been uncovering these new floras from the early Cretaceous in Colombia and Ecuador with beautiful, like these flowers, for instance. So you will see more about this in the next coming years, as many of these data are being analyzed. So let's go jump at the end of the Cretaceous. And that's something happened there that transformed the tropics forever. And that's what the beginning of the birth of the tropical rainforest, as we know it today. Well, just to be in the same page, here I define what a neotropical rainforest is, because, well, anytime you go back in time to the tropics, there will be a forest. It will be a tropical forest. But what I call a neotropical forest is this set of four elements. And when I see them together is when I will call, we have a neotropical rainforest. So it's a combination of climate, so high precipitation and high temperature, that the floristic dominated by some set of families, including the Fabaceae, Moraceae, and Onaceae, the ones you see here. If you're familiar with the tropics, those are the families that you always see. That is a multi-stratified forest, so it has many different layers. And the top layer, the canopy, is dominated by angiosperm, and it's a closed canopy. So most of the light is trapped at the top of the forest, and there are many lianas and epiphytes. And most of the leaves have the entire margin. They are big and they have drip tips. Now, about 66 million years ago, probably all you have heard about this meteorite that hit the Yucatan Peninsula and transformed the planet forever. Now, this meteorite was about 10 kilometers wide, so it's probably the size of Madrid. So imagine you focus on Madrid, and then you go away from Madrid, and you see the entire planet. And think about Madrid looking at the entire planet. Well, Madrid will look just like a tiny, tiny dot in the global landscape. Well, that was the size of this meteorite that hit the Yucatan Peninsula. And even if the meteorite had hit the Earth about 20 seconds later, nothing would have happened, because the meteorite would have hit the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and we had a major tsunami, but nothing of a global consequence. But the only reason it happened, the changes that I'm going to describe to you, is because it hit precisely the Yucatan Peninsula, that it has a big carbonate deposit. And this collision with the carbonate is what makes the world change. And if you see at the Moon, or Mars, or Venus, those planets that do not have plate tectonics, you will realize that the planets are always receiving meteorites. They are covered with holes. And there's something like that has always happened on Earth. It tells you a lot about what geological time really means. So over the span of the life on Earth, about 3.5 billion years, we have had many meteorite impacts. But it took just one tiny meteorite hitting at the precise time, in the precise location, the Yucatan Peninsula, to change the history of the planet forever. That's called contingency, and that's what dominates evolution. So it's something that happened at random. Nobody could predict a few hours before that the meteorite was going to hit the Yucatan Peninsula, but once it hit, changed the life forever. And you can understand why it changed. And this is an example of a major disturbance, and what happened after a major disturbance. We go to the forest we had before with different species, but basically the same forest, or we go to a forest that is completely different. So we spent about 15 years trying to answer this question, going to many different places, counting thousands of pollen grains, analyzing many leaves. So we went to the border of the Andes, like along this creek. So when you walk along this creek, from here to here, what you are doing is a time travel. In this particular place, you start at the base of at the top of the creek in about 85 million years, and you end at the bottom of the creek in about 23 million years. So you are going you are doing a time travel in the same location, and you analyze how the vegetation changed through time. So we explored also this big coal mine like Cerrejón, that is the biggest open pit coal mine in the world. We find this amazing animal, Titanoboa, a big snake, and this is how the snake looked like. And this is one of the most common animals we find in Cerrejón, and we find another of these one close to Bogota last year. And not only find animals, we find a lot of plants. So we have these floras from the Maastrichtian, so at the end of the Cretaceous, and floras from the Cenozoic, so at the beginning of the Cenozoic, after the KT impact. And of course, every time you have a real hard problem to solve, you have to use pollen, because the pollen has a big sample size, a stratigraphic resolution, so you can understand, measure time and look at the changes and a fine detail, and you can see the whole landscape by looking at the pollen. So by counting all these thousands of pollen grains, we can construct graphics like this one. So in the y-axis, you have geological time, going from 72 million years to 58 at the top, and every of these colors represent the duration of a particular morphotype of taxa through time. So you can estimate the rates of origination and extinction. And what we see in the record is that there is a massive extinction event right at the beginning, at the Cretaceous Tertiary event. We have the iridium layer, so we know precisely where this event occurred and how the plants respond to that particular event. Now the origination time increased about 7 million years later. So it took a long time for the diversity to recover after this extinction. Not only that, but at the landscape scale, there is a fundamental change in the composition of the forest. During the Cretaceous, here in the green color, the forest was not dominated by angiosperm, but in the Cenozoic, as today, in the orange, the angiosperm were already dominant in the ecosystem. You can also tell about the forest structure by looking at the venation density in the fossil leaves, and also at the delta C13 of the cuticles that are also preserved in the fossil record. Because if you go today to a closed canopy, and you measure the venation density from the leaves of the top of the tree to the bottom of the tree, you will see that there is a strong bimodal distribution, as most of the photosynthesis is happening at the top of the trees. The venation density is high, and even in the same tree, the venation density will be low in the lower part of the tree because the sunlight is not there. So we measure that in both the Cretaceous floras and the Cenozoic floras, and we realize that only until in the Cenozoic, we have the closed canopy forest that we have today. So after all these 15 years of data collecting, we reached this conclusion that there is a major transformation of the forest. From the Cretaceous, we have an open canopy, probably dominated by Araucaria, by gymnosperms, and we changed to the forest that we have today. So basically, the neotropical rainforest that we have today was born after this event. But this change begs the question. The angiosperm had been in the Cretaceous already for a long time, together with the gymnosperm. And the climate of the late Cretaceous, the latest Cretaceous and the early Cenozoic was very similar to each other. So why the forest didn't go back to the forest as it was before of the impact? Or why the angiosperm didn't took over during the Cretaceous? So we thought of 3 different alternatives, and probably all of them are working at the same time. First, that the Cretaceous forests have big herbivores, the dinosaurs, that were opening gaps all the time. The second is that there was an ecological selectivity in the canopy trees. So the Araucarias were only canopy trees. And imagine you go to the forest today and you kill every single tree. Well, if your species, your taxa only lives in the canopy, you will be out of the game. But if your clade also have something as a vine, as a liana, as a shrub, or as a plant that grows very fast, well, you will be able to recover. So it pays to be diverse. Once you have a very narrow ecological space, you are very prone to extinction, and probably that happened to the Araucaria. And lastly, that's when we see the major radiation of the legumes, when the legumes appears for the first time in the Cenozoic. And they come with this ability to fix nitrogens with the association of the roots. So they add nutrients to the soil. And also the meteorite itself, when it falls down, it brought a lot of iron all over the world. So I imagine this as, imagine you have a new garden and you want to plant everything from scratch. So you put nutrients to the soil, you plant the seeds. Well, the angiosperm had this ability to grow so fast that once they grow and they occupy the canopy, the gymnosperm were out of the game because they had not been able to reach the canopy ever again until our days. And you can see that also in the genetic record, thanks to this beautiful study by Ramirez and Susana Magallon a couple of years ago. They show that most of the angiosperm that we have today, the crown angiosperm, are a Cenozoic feature. And most of the angiosperms in the Cretaceous, they became extinct. So what lesson we learned from this event? That a single historical accident altered the evolutionary trajectory of tropical rainforests. And it has long-lasting effects until today. So we changed the play with different actors and a whole different scenario. Now, over the last 50, 60 million years, the CO2 has been going down and the planet has been cooling down. In general terms, sometimes there are warmings and coolings, but the general trend has been to cool down. And we see that reflecting the diversity of the neotropical rainforest. So in the red color, you see the temperature, and this is the y-axis is the geological time going from 66 to 20. And you see how if the curve goes to the left, so this is warming and this is cooling, and this is the diversity here that we can assess from the pollen record. And you see how the diversity follows the temperature trend. As the temperature increases, the diversity goes up, and when the temperature cools down, the diversity goes down over long time periods and short time periods. Well, but this is not the only biome that we have in the tropics, as I told you before. So let's see two major biomes that are quite contrasting to the rainforest, and those are the tropical savannas. And if you have not been to a savanna, I will highly recommend you to go to one of those because it's an amazing ecosystem. That's a photo from the Llanos in Colombia. And the xerophytic forest that you find in the Caatingas or in the northern part of South America, in Colombia and Venezuela. It will look like that. So we wanted to assess when the savannas originate, when we have these extensive savannas we have today. So to do that, we partnered together with an oil company that drilled a core in the middle of the Llanos today. And this is how a core looked like. So pieces of a tube of rock that went down 900 meters. And we have been analyzing the pollen grains. That is it's a good indicator of savanna over the past 7 million years. And as you see here, we don't see savannas. So the savannas, and today, if you see the graphic, this is a sample from the savanna today as seen from the pollen record. We know that the savannas had to evolve over the past 7 million years. We don't know when, but not before. We did something like that for the xerophytic forest in this Falcón province, and we found a beautiful, amazing fossil record of many different kinds of plants and animals, big crocodile like this gavial, or Purosaurus, this crocodile that used to be all over South America, tropical South America, and became extinct, or this freshwater turtle that is called Stupendemis, that used to be very common in many places in the Americas and was very common in these places in northern Venezuela. So this is how the Falcon province looks today, and this is how it looked 4 million years ago. So it's a major transformation of the landscape of the tropics in the last few million years. And you actually can see that in the genetic record. So the major radiations of the groups that occupy those biomes today, the C4 grassland, the C4 grasses, the agaves, the cacti, all of them are very recent phenomena, probably related to the expansion of the landscape coverage of these ecosystems. Now, of course, as the savanna increase and the xerophytic forest increase in area, has to come to the decrease of the rainforest. So I calculate that the rainforest today has, before the Industrial Revolution, of course, has decreased by 30% in land. And there is you know that there is a good relationship between area and number of species. Just by chance, as you increase the area of a biome, the number of species occupying that biome will go up. Well, the same happens if you go in the opposite way. If you decrease the area, you will expect an increase in the extinction of the clades within that biome. And that's now when I see clades like topologies like this one from Bombacoidea. And here you have geological time. And this is only done with DNA. Yeah, from 0 to 50 million years. And here I plot the diversity we see in the fossil record of the same group. We see the highest diversity 50 million years ago. But of course, you don't see that in the genetic record. What you see are these long branches. So when I see this cladogram, what I see is a lot of extinction rather than radiations of this particular group. And I bet you there are many groups like that in Amazonia today, where the group is really dominated by extinction rather than origination. You will be asking, well, why there is a savanna in the first place? Here I have plotted the mean annual temperature in the y-axis and mean annual precipitation, mean annual temperature in the x-axis and mean annual precipitation in the y-axis. And every point represents a plot of forest within the tropics. And you will realize that what really matters in the tropics is water rather than temperature. So at the same temperature, you can go from a tropical rainforest, a dry forest, a savanna, of a desert, just by decreasing the water available and increasing the length of the dry season. So in the tropics, it's all about water. So we decided to study why there is this sharp transition between the savannas and rainforests going to Colombia. And we went there first because the boundary itself has not moved too much. There are not many people living here, or not many agricultural products that has modified the border. And second, the geology underneath is basically the same. So the geology underneath the savannas is the same as the geology underneath the rainforest. And that's important because when you have the savannas, you introduce fires and you change the pH of the soil. But not because the fire was there, it's because you had the savanna in the first place. So that was the perfect setting to understand why we shift from rainforest to savanna in an ecotone that is less than a kilometer wide. So first we plot the mean annual precipitation. As expected, you will see here that there is a band of rainfall where half of the forest, or half of the plants would be a savanna biome, or half of the plots would be a forest biome. And there is a gap in between of tree cover. So you either have forest or savanna, nothing in between. So we not only analyze the total annual rainfall, but the length of the dry season. And when you do that, you can start to separate the savannas from the rainforest. So it's about the length of the dry season that makes the change, the shift from savanna to rainforest. And then we analyze what happened during the dry season. And we found out that if we plot in this map the number of consecutive dry days during the dry season, there is a sharp boundary, about 10 days, that if you have more than 10 consecutive dry days during the dry season, the biome you are going to have is a savanna. If you have less than 10 days, the biome is going to be a tropical rainforest. Of course, this is this threshold probably is related to CO2. And I don't know, and my expectation is as CO2 goes up, this threshold will decrease because a plant can increase, a tree can increase the water use efficiency as the CO2 goes up and can be more competitive to a grass during a water stress. Now, there are several biomes I won't have time to talk about because I almost running out of time, but we have the tropical dry forest that evolved in the Middle Eocene. We have the Andean forest, and this is also a fantastic ecosystem because it's a brand new biome, has evolved in the last 20 million years, and is prone to many evolutionary studies. Just to give you a glimpse of how complex the Andes are, is this study that is being done by Sebastián Gómez, a PhD student at the University of São Paulo. And if you are familiar with the Andes, probably you have heard that is this, along the Andes, if you go to the border between Peru and Ecuador, the Andes goes down. It's a low relief. The mountains don't go up to 4,000 meters. And if you go south or north of that, all the Andes reach 4,000 meters. Well, he has been studying the evolution of the landscape, of the elevation of this block of rock, of the mountain, and he realized that by looking at zircons and very geological techniques, that the mountain there reached the elevation of the Andes, the 4,000 meters, 5,000 meters, about 10 million years ago. And then the process that was making the mountain go up ceased. And for the last 10 million years, the mountain has been weathering away because the weather in the tropics is very high, so the rate of weathering is higher than the rate of uplift. So we calculate that in about 5 to 10 million years, this mountain, the block of mountain, will go away, will be just low hills. So it'll tell you how active these mountains are and how the geological processes take a long time. We have the Central American rainforests that are highly related to the Great American Biotic Interchange and the rise of the Isthmus of Panama. But we'll take another hour just to tell you all the things we have learned about this collision between Panama and Colombia. We know now that most of the Central American seaway, this deep water connection that joined the Caribbean with the Pacific, closed about 10 million years ago, instead of the 3.5 that we always have assumed. We have the Paramos and Punas, the Atlantic forests, and the Yungas that are amazing ecosystems we know very little about and are almost disappearing, but probably are connected to the rise of the Andes. Without the Andes, these two ecosystems should not exist because of the position in the subtropics. And it's only because of the Andes that they exist, and we don't know what before and what will come later. And we have the desert that are also highly related to the Andes. And I wrote, if you want more interested about the tropical biomes, I wrote this paper last year where I explain more details, all the things I have told you about. And lastly, so one critical question is what is going to happen to Amazon? And you have to care about this regardless of where do you live. Because most of the drinking water that we consume every single day is linked to the water that is transpired in Amazonia, because it's a big, massive ecosystem. So even if you are in Nepal, you have to care about Amazonia, because if something happened to the water in Amazonia, you won't be able to drink water in Nepal. And these models that I told you about, the global circulation models, they have contrasted predictions of what's going to happen to Amazonia. Some models predict that it's going to transform into a savanna. Others say that it's going to rain twice. So to solve that, we really need to go into geological time, because these forests, they operate at a longer time scale. So even the longest ecological study you can think about, let's say 50, 60 years, compared to the life of a forest as a whole, is basically nothing. We need several generations to understand how an ecosystem of this scale changes. So one way is going back into the geological record. But because most of Amazonia is covered with rainforest, the only way is to actually make a a core of rock. And we put together this team. We were going to drill 4 cores. Now we only were able to drill 2 because of the pandemic and the global inflation. But everything you can think that we can study in a core will be studied. The first core, we finished drilling that in Acre in December. We obtained 940 meters of rock and this is in the meter 210. There are pieces of plants there. And I estimate what we drilled was the last 12 million years of the evolution of Amazonia, of Western Amazonia. And I'm going to Minnesota. That's where the repositories for this kind of cores are. So we took the core from Acre to Minnesota, where they have this national library of cores. And next Monday, from 1 week, we are going to open the cores for the first time. Not even the guys that were in the drilling know what we actually obtained. And for the next 2 years, we are going to study this core as much as possible. Now, to do that, we realized that we have to do far more than we had done before. And now, because as Humboldt, you were going mad with the diversity, well, with the pollen it's the same. Every time you find a pollen grain as a fossil, you have to compare that pollen grain with the entire flora of Amazonia. And that's something that no human brain can do, because it's impossible to memorize 20,000 different forms. But now, thanks to neural network and artificial intelligence, we are able to do that. But to do that, you need good training sets. And that's what institutions that the Smithsonians are good for, because we have collections that nobody had. And it's our mandate to actually use those collections. So we have, in Panama, we have the Smithsonian Palynological Collection that was mostly built by Alan Graham during 40 years, and it has 14,000 species. We have been digitizing the whole collection over the past year and a half. We already have taken 500,000 photos of pollen grains. Probably you should, I really like pollen grains of 7,000 species, and we expect to finish that by the end of next year. We have in total 14,000 species. When I mean digitized, we are photographing 20 pollen grains for every taxa, and every pollen grain is a stack of many, many photos in high resolution. So you can see the grain as you will be looking at the grain at the microscope. And also we are doing 5 grains in confocal microscopy. That's the photo you see here on your right, that using the same slide of a standard pollen slide, you are able to see the grain with a much higher resolution. All those images will become public and we produce them. So you can use them for anything that you want. So to summarize what we have learned from the fossil record, well, first that there is a long gap between the evolution of morphological and physiological novelties and its geographical expansion. We see that with the angiosperms. They evolved 140 million years ago, but only until the Cenozoic they became the dominant elements of the biomes, or the grasses, or all these plants that evolved and then became many millions of years later, the dominant in their particular biomes. And that the levels of CO2 and the amount and seasonality of precipitation have produced fundamental transformation in the neotropical biome. It's not really temperature in the tropics. It's water, in how much water falls throughout the year. That must be the focus rather than temperature. Now it's staggering the change we have done to our planet, especially in relation to CO2. So when I was born in 1969, and the CO2 there was 320 parts per million. 55 years later, we gone from 320 to 426. 320 was the CO2 of the late Pliocene, 2.6 million years ago. And the CO2 we have today is the CO2 of the early Pliocene, 2.6 million years later. So imagine that in 55 years, we changed what the planet took 2.6 million years. So I think humans love paleontology so much that we decided to do this planetary experiment to reproduce a global warming to compare that with the fossil record. And it seems crazy, but that's what we have done. And life has been, so if you are a young element in the audience, my advice is do not despair. So life has been on the planet for 3.8 billion years, and will continue for the next 3 billion years. Life has survived massive extinctions, like the meteorite in the Yucatan Peninsula, and it comes back. So it will survive us. So it's not about the survival of the planet, but the survival of us. Now we think ourselves of the most intelligent species on the planet. And we know that because we decide to label ourselves Homo sapiens. Well, now is the time to prove it. We'll be able to acclimate to the changes that are happening and will continue to happen for the next thousands of years or not. That's where the challenge is. And it's impossible to acclimate if you don't know what is happening and how the systems that are changing operate. And that's our mission as a scientist. That's what we have to deliver. Because decisions are going to be taken anyway by politicians everywhere, with or without the information. And who else can do that but us? So I think it has never been a best time in history to be a plant scientist. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. We have time for a couple short questions.
Thank you very much for an amazing talk. I would like to get your opinion on whether the meteorite impact in South America can be extended for the rest of the tropics. There is evidence of dispersal from Africa to South America for the rainforest. Did the African forest survive or something? Thank you.
Yes, yeah, so if you go back to the 66 million years ago, Australia was still south, so it has not, the northern part of Australia and Papua New Guinea were not in the tropics. And most of Southeast Asia was under the ocean, so the real tropics were a Gondwanian feature. So we have Africa and South America. And I would expect, we see that the same changes in Africa. But the difference with this South America, we have the Andes. And the Andes allow the rock to be exposed. So we are able to study the geological history of the last 120 million years because during the process of uplift of the Andes, all the rocks that contain the fossils were exposed to the surface. In Africa, we don't have the Andes, so the rocks are still underneath the deep basins, so it's very harder to study that in South America. But yeah, my expectation, we have seen basically the similar changes in Africa.
Thanks for the presentation and congratulations for this excellent work. I would like to talk about Anthropocene. As far as I understand, there is no consensus among the geological society that it's real or not, or there is no changes that to label as a geological period. What is your opinion about that? Can you explain a little bit about
Well, I think geologists, we are not that different from plant taxonomies when they decide, agree on a plant name. So for the PETM, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, it took about 25 years for geologists to agree where to put the boundary, because we have something called the GSSP. So we put together these committees and we decide where to put, it's called the golden spike, and it's a nail, a golden nail, that you go someplace on Earth and you put this nail inside the rock, and every time you say Paleocene-Eocene boundary, because you are correlating your rocks to that particular nail. And for the PETM, that's located in Luxor in Egypt. It took 25 years for something that, well, how many people care about the precise location of the PETM? So for the Anthropocene, yes. But for me, it was useful in the sense that the conditions of the last since the Industrial Revolution are so different from the Holocene that we always have to add, it's pre-industrial or post-industrial, because the Holocene doesn't have anything to do with what we had done in the last 170 years. So I will vote yes, but it will take a long time for us to agree on anything. That's
Okay. So I think, is there a final question?
Okay, so you mentioned different continents, and I'm really thinking about the history of Australia, starting off in the Antarctic and moving further north. It was rainforest most of the time and then dried out. And you've got a lot of different things there, like persistence of the Cretaceous gymnosperm families, etc., which you also have in South America, but different in Australia, I think. But you've also got these pockets of rainforests surrounded by savanna and woodlands, which potentially could lead to some interesting comparisons of the sort you were alluding to. So I wonder if, as well as that, you've got the accelerated change because of the latitudinal change. I wonder what you might say about doing some comparisons of that sort between South America, for instance, and Australia.
Yeah, Australia has always fascinated to me because it's like a ship that starts in the pole and ends in the tropics and carry out the Gondwanan stockage that also happened in South America. So it's prone, and the fossil record is also good. There are excellent paleobotanists in Australia. So there are many things to compare between Australia and South America, and I hope with the increase of knowledge in South America that we have done in the last 15 years, we finally could do meaningful comparison with Australia. That's something that has to happen because it's too interesting not to do it.
Okay, so I think now it's time for our coffee break. Let's just thank Carlos for an excellent presentation. Thanks,